Hi and welcome to the Music Production Handbook. So in this video I'm going to take a look at using the EQ. In the previous video I discussed the parameters, whereby this time I'm going to actually use it and so you can hear what's going on. For demonstratory purposes, it's always good to use EQ in context, so balancing out the drums and then applying the EQ and listening to what it does in context, actually as to whether you're making things better or kind of making it worse, for want of a better word. So what I'm going to use, first of all, I'm just going to deal with the kick drum. Part of the EQ actually comes from checking your phasing. Now phasing is an acoustic phenomenon, and when you're using multiple microphones on drum kits, then there's a big chance that this will play an effect, or have an effect, should I say, on the sound. With certain frequencies cancelling out. You can read about it in my one of the early blogs, and I'll put a link to it there. So the first thing I need to check actually is whether the bass drum is in phase or not, because I've got two microphones going on there, and also you could look into whether the room mics, the overheads, the room mics, whether they're in phase. The snare mic, it's a phasing nightmare. So what I'm going to do is just look at the bass drum. I've got a gain plugin that I've used in Logic. Pro Tools is trim, and other DAWs will have the ability to invert the phase and the polarity. So I'm just going to play the bass drum, and what we're looking for is how the frequencies of the bottom end, if it thins out, then they're cancelling one another. Whereas if it's quite thick and heavy and weighted, then it means that those frequencies are said to be in phase. So here we go. So at the moment, the two channels are in phase. Should I say, the polarity of those two channels are the same at the moment. And I'm going to invert the phase in a minute to see whether there's any difference. So here we go. And change. So you could hear there's a big difference when I pressed the phase invert. That all of a sudden it went very thin. That basically means that the frequencies were cancelling out, especially around those sort of low mids, and it made it sound a lot weaker in terms of its tonality. Whereas when I brought it back in and made the two channels back in the same polarity, then all of a sudden the richness and the body of the bottom end of that bass drum started to come through. So the decision that was made by the person recording it at the time, if they've then inverted the polarity using the phase reversal switch on a preamp on the channel, they made the correct decision. Okay, so that's the first thing, and I can actually remove it because I'm not going to actually use it. So I'm going to bring up the EQ, and I'm going to just check out the bass drum on the inside. It was using an RE320. I'm going to just do this individually so you can hear the decisions that I'm making. So this is the sound of the bass drum. Bit of spill there, doesn't matter. Now, the first thing that I can hear is that there's no weight to it, and it's a little bit undefined. Now, the first thing that I'm going to tackle is the low mid area, because that's where I think the detail will really come into play. And I tend to try and use the EQ in the areas that they belong. So 100 hertz in and around this lower mid. The 250 and the 751 that they're set here, I like to keep them around the middle part, and then the blue one that says 2.5 kilohertz, I like to keep that at the top end. Then it makes it easier to navigate. What you don't want is this one down here, and it gets a bit confusing. Try and be methodical about it all, and let the different EQs treat the areas that you need to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift up the 250 hertz, and I'm going to over-exaggerate it for demonstratory purposes. But what I'm going to look for is the kind of mask where it sounds almost like a cardboard box. The way sort of the bass drum, the quality of it sounds really sort of poor, and that's why I'm looking for the bad frequency essentially. So if I just turn that off, so this is no EQ. I'm going to sweep it. There. There for me is where it sounds really horrible. So the first step I'm going to do is just going to narrow that down, and I'm actually going to dip it. So I'm not listening for too long, and I'm not taking massive chunks out of it, because as you can see, the more I bring it down, the frequencies in and around it also become affected. I just want to soften that area. So I've only taken it down by 4.5 dB. So now if I play it, no EQ. For me, when I put that EQ in, it kind of just opened out and allowed the bottom end and the top end to come through, and there wasn't this kind of flabbiness in the middle, if you like. And I'll play it again so you can hear. So I'll turn off the EQ. For me, that sounds much better. So that's the first point. I mean, I can move that down a touch or whatever I want to do, and just sort of hone that in. I might change my decision a bit later, just ever so slightly. Next thing I do is I'm going to add a low cut. The reason being is that I want to work within the range of my speakers. I don't have a sub here, so I can't go down to the sort of real low ends to listen to that. And then if I put it on a bigger system that does, then it may mean it's out of control. What I want to work to is the limits of my speakers. So I'm going to set it at 40. So it gives me just a little bit extended compared to what my speakers are. But it just means that I won't have any nasty surprise on a bigger system. It just plays safe. And it's always a good trick when you're working in your own home studio. Next thing I need to do is have a listen to that. Just tightens the bottom end up there. Now I am going to just add a little bit of a notch, cheeky notch here, just to give it a little bit of a lift. You can see it lifts at 50 Hertz. So I'm just going to play that again. So without. Just gives it a little bit more weight. And I'm going to lift this up, and I'm going to take this down to about 65 Hertz as a starting point. And I'm just going to lift it just 2.5 dB and listen to that as well. So without. Nice. I'm just giving a little bit more solidarity in that lower end. The other thing I might want to check out is the actual batter head of the bass drum, in terms of bringing out the click to it. So I'm going to start with this 2.5 kilohertz. I'm just going to lift that up and over exaggerate it. I didn't have to move it far actually. There. So what I've done is I've just brought out the click of the bass drum, just slightly exaggerated. I've not gone mad, not added loads of EQ, because it brings up a lot of other things in and around it. And the final thing I can just bring in maybe is just a little bit of the high cut, just to get rid of some of the any of the air in around that might be affecting sort of the bits of the hi-hats and stuff. See, if I bring it down here, it affects it, just affects the air in the bass drum. I just want to just tidy it. So there, it just kind of just helps it out. So essentially, there's the kick in sorted, and if I bypass the whole EQ, so you can instantly hear that there's a much more positive sound. Next EQ I'm going to use it actually and just do it without having the ability of having the graphical sight. I'm going to use the virtual mix rack by Slate Digital. Now there's some really cool little bits and pieces in here. The first thing I am going to do is just show you this custom series lift. This is great. Two areas. Essentially, it's a shelf EQ boosting. So I'm going to set it to big, and what I am going to do is just look to bring out the weight of the bass drum on the outside, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to tuck in another EQ just to deal with potentially the mids. But let's have a listen first. So without. So it sounds a bit flabby in that lower mid again, so I will need to deal with that. But let's just look about giving it some weight first. So I'm just going to I can feel that kind of low end punch, but I'm still not happy about this lower mid. So scrolling down, I'm going to bring in the FGS, which is that famous Oxford bass company. And the first thing I'm going to do is just do the same as I did with the Logic EQ, 40 Hertz. Just going to tuck it in there. I'm going to look at this low mid first. So bring it in around about that 300 Hertz because of the previous EQ as a starting point. I'm going to exaggerate it and then listen for that kind of box sound. It's there. I've really exaggerated that. There we go. If I bypass the EQ, yeah, you can almost hear the bass drum skin. It's that resonant there, where it's probably slightly loose. And I've just gotten rid of that, and I'm just going to try and introduce a bit more click to the bass drum if I can, or just on the outside, just a bit of brightness. So I'm going to just... So without the EQ, much better. So now I'm going to move on to the snare drum. So let's take a look at the snare actually and see what that's doing in terms of the EQ. So let's bring the snare in. Okay, I fear that it's going to need some help. Let's look at it with the Logic EQ. So I'm going to start off by removing any of the low frequencies here. And I'm going to take it up until the point where it actually affects the snare. And then I'm going to roll it back. I'm going to solo it just so we can hear that. So you can hear that's affected the low end of the snare. I'm going to bring it back. Somewhere around there is quite cool. I'm going to bring in the low end of the snare, the kind of weight. And I'm going to bring out also the snap. So I'm just going to narrow that. I'm going to find the snap. There's also a mask in there, so let's find that. So if I bypass it, Some may find that kind of ring really annoying. It doesn't bother me. It's part of the overtone of that snare. But should you want to find that, we can. So let's have a look. There it is. You can hear it resonating. That's where the resonant frequency of that is. So then you could then reduce it. Now, you won't obviously get rid of it in its entirety due to the fact that it's got overtones of that as well. So 520 was the sort of resonant frequency there. So 1040, 2080, and then so forth. There are harmonics of that. But for me, the fundamental was there. And so I've just softened it, put it back in its context. The other thing to take a look at this point as well will be the overheads. This is where a lot of information is going to come from in terms of the rest of the drums. So check that out in its context as well. And for that purpose as well, I'll use the, go back to the Slate virtual mix racks for these. And just take a starting point. Again, low mids. So I'll start off with the overhead snare. I'll put it in the centre just so you can hear it. So. That low mid is just, it's there on everything. And actually, I'm going to use this EQ as well to help with my toms. I'm going to bring out a bit of brightness on the snare. And just bring out a bit of the shine on the cymbals, on the hi-hat. So without, with. And let's take a look at the other one. Again, I'll centralise that so you can hear it easier. First of all, go down, find. There it is. Don't want to get rid of it entirely. I'm going to take that, add some of that low end again. Get rid of some of that bottom end. Let's bring the two of them together. And I'm going to just take the EQs off. So it sounds really kind of messed up in the middle there. But now I'm going to split them. So I'm going to put my, I'm going to do it from audience perspective. And then if I just turn off the EQs there, I'm going to just sort of turn it off and go without. I'm going to give the snare back its middle there. But you can see, it's now starting to sound much better, much more together. And you can then look at the toms as well. We could fetch in another one, and we'll look at one of the other Slate EQs there. We'll look at the FGN. So floor tom, we've got a bit of floor tom action there. I'm just going to loop it around to just get around that section. I'm just going to bring it in. Okay, first instinct is to bring in that kind of low end, and I'm going to get rid of, because this is now a set area, the lowest I can do really to get rid of that mask is the 360. So I'm just going to take that away there. Which is sounding cool, and I'm going to bring up that around about 4K, and that's just going to bring out a bit of stick attack. And with this, I'm just going to up the output a little bit. So this is the floor tom. I'm going to just turn it off. There we go. Sounds much more meaty. And then we'll just take a look at that other tom as well. Bring that in. Again, I'm going to give that a lot more help. A bit more stick. Ah, there it is. And just give it potentially a bit more. Don't need to give it any more output either. And there we go. So I've just very quickly, using some strategic EQing and bits of cutting and boosting, I've now gone from this, which is without EQ, to this. So just using EQ, you can really shape and transform the sound of your drums. Obviously, the capture comes down to it as well. If you can get a really good capture of your drums or any instrument that you're doing, that really will give you a good solid start, and then it's just shaping. So the next thing to do is to go away and have a play, really listen to what you're doing, boost those EQs to listen to where to find the bad frequencies, cut them away, really play with it, and then very quickly you'll start to develop the taste as to what you want it to sound like, how you want it to sound, and you'll start to see marked improvements in terms of your EQ decision, and also recognizing those frequencies and what sounds good and what sounds not so good. Thank you for watching. Please share, like the Facebook page, and check out the website for blogs and other videos, content as it goes up. And happy mixing. Cheers.